Close your eyes for a second and picture the White House. You see that iconic, dazzling white stone, right? That symbol of power and stability, standing tall in Washington, D.C. It feels like it's been there forever, untouchable. But what if I told you that just over 200 years ago, that very building, the heart of the American government, was left a smoking, charred, black shell? That the president had to flee for his life, and the whole, brand new capital city was set ablaze by a foreign enemy? This isn't just a fire story. It's a terrifying, almost unbelievable tale of a young country brought to its knees. A story that starts with a little-known war and ends with the most famous house in America literally going up in flames. Get ready, because this is the weird story of how the White House once burned down. It's hard to picture it now. The white-columned mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue wreathed in smoke, its walls glowing red as flames licked the night sky. Today, the White House is one of the most recognizable symbols of the United States. But in August of 1814, it looked more like a scene from a nightmare. The nation was still young, barely 38 years old, and its capital, Washington City, as it was then called, was a half-finished collection of muddy streets, scattered buildings, and ambitious dreams. And in one chaotic summer evening, the British Army came marching straight into it, intent on burning those dreams to the ground. The War of 1812 wasn't exactly America's finest moment. It started partly out of pride and partly out of frustration. The British were still treating the United States like a rebellious teenager, harassing American ships, impressing U.S. sailors into the Royal Navy, and restricting trade. The young republic had had enough. President James Madison, small, bookish, and deeply idealistic, believed that America needed to assert itself. So, in June 1812, the country declared war on the greatest naval power on Earth. What followed was 2 years of uneven battles, failed invasions of Canada, and burned towns on both sides. Then, in 1814, the British decided to make a statement. The Americans had burned the city of York, modern-day Toronto, including its parliament buildings. The British would return the favor by striking at the symbolic heart of America itself. The mood in Washington was a bizarre mix of panic and ridiculous denial. For months, people had refused to believe the British would actually attack the capital. Why would they? They argued. It's too far inland. It's too well defended. Except, it wasn't well defended at all. The entire defense of the city was a joke, a mess of disorganized militias and volunteer forces. Secretary of War John Armstrong had famously and foolishly dismissed the idea of an attack on the capital, claiming the British wouldn't bother. The military situation was catastrophic. When the alarm finally sounded, the government scrambled and threw together a ragtag army, maybe 6,000 men, a mix of regulars and untrained farmers, and sent them out to a place called Bladensburg. Madison, against the advice of his generals, actually rode out with them. He was, after all, the commander-in-chief. What happened at the Battle of Bladensburg wasn't a battle, it was a rout. It was so fast and so embarrassing that people later called it the Bladensburg races, because the American militiamen, seeing the trained, professional British soldiers advancing, simply turned tail and ran. They dropped their muskets, abandoned their cannons, and sprinted for the nearest path back to D.C. President Madison, witnessing this humiliation, had to be hustled away by his aides, barely escaping capture. The road to Washington was wide open. The Redcoats were coming. On August 24, 1814, British troops led by Major General Robert Ross marched toward Washington. That left Washington completely exposed. President Madison and his cabinet fled the city, carrying what government papers they could. But one person stayed behind long enough to make history: Dolley Madison, the First Lady. Back at the president's house, what everyone now calls the White House, Dolley was in a frantic, terrifying race against time. Her husband had left her with a simple order: be ready to leave. But Dolley was not the kind of woman to abandon history to a foreign enemy. Her job, she decided, was to save the national treasures. Dolley Madison wasn't just the president's wife. She was the social heartbeat of early Washington. Known for her grace, charm, and formidable composure, she refused to abandon the White House until she was sure the country's most important treasures were safe. As British troops approached, Dolley ordered the house slaves and servants to start packing up the important documents and the silver plate. But there was one thing she absolutely refused to leave behind, something priceless: a massive, famous portrait of George Washington himself. It was a full-length, life-size painting, screwed high up on a wall in the state dining room. The frame was screwed too tightly to the wall, and the canvas was too brittle to cut quickly. Finally, she ordered two servants, Paul Jennings, a young enslaved man, and another man named Barker, to take an axe and break the frame, pull out the canvas, and roll it up. They managed it just in time. The sound of the retreating American soldiers pounding past the house was a terrifying signal. With the portrait of the nation's first president safely tucked into a carriage, along with a few personal papers, Dolly Madison got into her own coach and fled across the Potomac River. Just hours later, the victorious British soldiers, tired, thirsty, and deeply irritated, marched straight into an eerily quiet, suddenly deserted capital city. General Ross and his troops marched directly to the president's house. In one of history's strangest scenes, the British troops entered the house and found the dining table set for a lavish dinner. Madison and his guests had been planning to eat when word came that the enemy was approaching. So the redcoats sat down, toasted their success with the president's own wine, perhaps a fine Madeira, and ate the abandoned meal. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical act of political disrespect. We are sitting at your table, on your land, eating your dinner, while you run and hide. But the dinner was just the appetizer. Afterward, the British soldiers began methodically setting the house on fire. This wasn't about conquering territory. It was about humiliation and vengeance. They gathered all the furniture, doused it in a flammable substance, and piled it up in the middle of the rooms. They used rockets, torches, and even the draperies to spread the flames. Soon the entire mansion was engulfed, glowing like a beacon in the humid August night. The fire devoured everything: furniture, documents, even the elegant blue and gold curtains Dolly had chosen herself. The flames were said to shoot 50 feet into the air. The president's house, which had stood as a symbol of the new republic's hope, was now a hollow shell. The destruction wasn't limited to the White House. The British were methodical. They moved on to the United States Capitol building, the colossal structure that housed the Senate and the House of Representatives. They torched the Capitol, the Treasury, and other public buildings, leaving Washington a burning ruin. They did the same thing: broke in, piled up the furniture and papers, and lit the fires. The Library of Congress, which at the time was a relatively small collection housed in the Capitol, was also completely consumed. Priceless books and documents, the early written history of the United States, turned to ash. The glow from the fires could be seen as far away as Baltimore. Eyewitnesses described the night sky as a hellish orange, with thick plumes of smoke twisting into the heavens. The capital city of the United States had, in a single night, become a blazing monument to the failure of its own defense. And then, just when it seemed the destruction couldn't get worse, the weather turned. Just as the destruction reached its terrible peak, with the Capitol and the president's house both fully ablaze, the story took a completely unpredictable turn. A fierce thunderstorm rolled through, bringing sheets of rain that doused many of the fires. This wasn't just rain. It was a torrential downpour, a cyclonic blast of wind and water that struck the city with a violence few had ever seen. This was a hurricane, or at least, the worst part of a major tropical storm. It hit Washington like a divine intervention, or perhaps a cosmic protest against the destruction. The wind was so powerful it tore off the roofs of houses that hadn't been burned by the British. Some accounts even describe a tornado touching down in the city, tearing roofs off houses and scattering British troops in confusion. It reportedly lifted 2 of the British cannons right off the ground, throwing them several feet in the air. More shockingly, it killed a number of the British soldiers with flying debris or collapsing structures. In a single hour, Mother Nature had done more damage and caused more casualties to the British forces than the entire American defense at Bladensburg. The storm's immediate effect was to put out the massive fires the British had started. Washington, by pure chance or providence, had been saved by the storm. General Ross, who had been so proud of his disciplined campaign, found himself in a nightmare scenario. His men were soaked, morale was plummeting, and his mission of strategic revenge was being interrupted by an act of God. Fearing that the storm would isolate them and that the disorganized American militia might regroup and counterattack, General Ross made a critical decision. He wasn't going to stick around. By the morning of August 25th, less than 24 hours after they had marched triumphantly into the capital, the main British force retreated, slipping out of the city as quickly as they had arrived. The morning after the British retreat and the ferocious storm, Washington, D.C., was a picture of absolute desolation. A thick, acrid smell of burnt wood and wet ash hung in the air. The president's house was a blackened, hollow shell. The stone walls were still standing, but they were scarred by fire, and the interior was completely gutted. The roof was gone, the windows were shattered, and the once elegant rooms were now open to the sky. The scene at the Capitol building was even worse. The entire roof of the Senate wing had collapsed. The library was gone, and the hall of the House of Representatives was a mess of twisted iron and fallen plaster. The sheer scale of the destruction was a profound shock to the American public. This was the first time in the history of the United States that its capital had been seized and symbolically destroyed by an enemy. The word humiliation doesn't even begin to cover the feeling. President James Madison and his cabinet returned to the city 2 days later, making a somber entry. Madison's small, dignified figure rode past the smoking ruins, and the sight must have been crushing. He was facing a political nightmare. Not only had he presided over the disastrous defense of the Capitol, but now he had no proper home and no office. The first and most immediate crisis was where to govern. The government was technically homeless. Congress had no place to meet. Madison and his staff first tried to work out of a house a few blocks from the burned-out White House, but it quickly became clear that a more permanent solution was needed. There was a genuine, serious debate in Congress about whether or not to even abandon Washington, D.C. altogether. Many Northern politicians, who had always opposed the capital being located in the swampy, isolated territory on the Potomac, saw this as their chance. They argued that the city was a strategic and economic liability. It was too easy to attack, and it hadn't developed into the bustling center they had hoped for. They wanted to move the government back to a safer, more established city like Philadelphia or a city further inland. This became a huge political battle. The proponents of keeping the capital in D.C., led by people like Secretary of State James Monroe, argued fiercely that to abandon the city now would be a massive psychological victory for the British. It would be an admission of defeat, a surrender to the memory of the fire. They argued that the destruction was a stain on the nation's honor, and the only way to wash that stain away was to rebuild immediately and with more resolve than ever before. The tide finally turned when a wealthy local resident, General John P. Van Ness, offered his private home, a grand mansion near the Potomac, as a temporary meeting place for Congress. Another building, a hotel called Blodgett's Hotel, was quickly converted into temporary offices for the various government departments. This provided just enough stability to quell the movement to move the capital. The crucial turning point came in October 1814, when Congress voted to stay in Washington. The vote was close, but the psychological argument, the need to show strength and resilience, won the day. The decision was made to not just stay, but to immediately and vigorously rebuild the burned buildings, starting with the president's house and the Capitol. The fire, which was supposed to be a symbol of America's defeat, was quickly being transformed into a symbol of its determined spirit. But the rebuilding would take years, and the White House would never quite be the same. With the immediate crisis of governance settled, the Capitol would stay in Washington. The monumental task of rebuilding began. President James Madison and First Lady Dolley Madison were the visible face of this resilience, and it was Dolley who truly rose to the occasion, becoming the unofficial first builder of the nation's morale. The Madisons couldn't exactly move into the charred, roofless shell of the president's house. For the next year, they lived in a small, rented house, the Taylor House, and then later moved to a larger, more suitable residence known as the Octagon House. Dolley Madison turned their temporary homes into the functional and social heart of the recovering government. Even though the Capitol was in ruins, she insisted on maintaining a level of dignity and openness, continuing her famous weekly receptions, where she would welcome everyone from powerful congressmen to common citizens. These gatherings were more than just parties. They were a vital act of political stability. By keeping the social engine of the Capitol running, Dolley projected an image of control and normalcy that belied the chaos outside. It was her way of saying to the world, and especially to the British. You burned our buildings, but you did not break our spirit or stop our government from functioning. Her personal effort was crucial in convincing people that Washington was still the capital and that life and government business must go on. Meanwhile, the arguments over how to rebuild were fierce. The original architect of the White House, James Hoban, was brought back to oversee the restoration. But everyone had an opinion. Some people wanted to scrap the original design and build something completely new, something grander and more modern. Others, the traditionalists, wanted to replicate the original design exactly. The ultimate decision, backed by President Madison, was to restore the original buildings as closely as possible. This was another critical symbolic choice. It was a statement that the ideals and foundations of the young republic, as embodied in the architecture chosen by George Washington, were still sound and would not be replaced. The rebuilding was a process of reclaiming the physical symbols of their democracy. The process of reconstruction was slow and expensive. Workers had to deal with the sheer mess left by the fire and the storm. The stone walls of the president's house, while standing, were structurally weak and needed extensive repairs. The interior was a total loss and had to be completely rebuilt from the ground up, requiring new lumber, new plaster, and new decorative materials. One of the most enduring, yet often debated, parts of the story centers on why the president's house became the White House. The popular legend, one that has persisted for 2 centuries, is that after the fire, the building was painted white to cover the black scorch marks left by the flames. This is a nice, dramatic story, but it's mostly a myth. The building's stone walls were already painted with a white, lime-based whitewash called paint duty back in 1798 to protect the soft sandstone from the elements and frost. However, the repainting after the 1814 fire was indeed a major undertaking, and the intense white color necessary to fully cover the extensive black char marks likely reinforced the name. The name, White House, had been used informally for years, but the burning and subsequent brilliant white repainting sealed the name into the national consciousness. The new name, the White House, was officially adopted by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. But the fire cemented the public's image of a dazzling, resilient white structure, standing proudly against the memory of the black smoke. As the reconstruction efforts slowly got underway in Washington, a completely different scene was unfolding across the ocean in Europe. The peace negotiations to end the War of 1812 had been dragging on for months in the neutral city of Ghent, now in Belgium. The American and British delegations were meeting in a stalemate, arguing over border territories, fishing rights, and the core issue of British interference with American shipping. The British delegation, riding high on the news of their successful raid and the burning of Washington, felt they had the upper hand. The destruction of the capital was a massive diplomatic chip, giving them strong leverage at the negotiating table. They initially demanded big concessions, like the creation of an independent Native American state in the Great Lakes region and the demilitarization of the American side of the border. They saw America as a defeated power. However, a strange sequence of events began to weaken the British position just as the news of the Washington fire reached them. First, the main reason the British had been able to focus on America, the defeat of Napoleon, was not permanent. While Napoleon was initially defeated and exiled, Europe was still unstable. The British were wary of committing too many resources to a messy, frustrating war in North America when they needed to maintain a strong presence in Europe. The war in America was becoming a costly distraction. More importantly for the Americans, a key victory far from Washington began to change the tone of the negotiations. Just 2 weeks after the burning of Washington, a massive American naval and land victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain completely broke a major British invasion attempt into New York. This victory proved that the American military, while struggling in some areas, was still a serious fighting force capable of massive defense. The news arrived in Ghent, shifting the British attitude from demanding to merely negotiating. Then came the final and most decisive event. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. Remarkably, the treaty was essentially a return to the status quo. It didn't solve any of the major issues that caused the war in the first place. No mention of American shipping rights, no border changes. It simply agreed to stop fighting and return all conquered territory. It was a draw, A truce, a collective sigh of relief. But here is the truly weird historical twist. The slow speed of communication in 1814 meant that the signing of the peace treaty did not immediately stop the fighting. News took weeks, even months, to cross the Atlantic. So, while the treaty was signed in Europe on December 24, 1814, the most famous and decisive battle of the war was yet to be fought. This final, unnecessary battle would be the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. General Andrew Jackson, leading a ragtag army of frontiersmen, pirates, and militiamen, absolutely decimated the British forces in a stunningly lopsided victory. It was a massive morale boost for the Americans, and because the news of the victory arrived in Washington before the official news of the peace treaty, it made the war feel like a resounding American victory, completely overshadowing the embarrassment of the Washington burning. The timing was everything. The burning of the White House, while a disaster, was now just a dark chapter in a war that the young nation felt it had ultimately won. The rebuilding effort, therefore, was not just an act of recovery, but an act of triumphant reassertion. Among all the powerful names associated with the White House, Washington, Madison, Hoban, one of the most important, yet least known, figures in this fire story is Paul Jennings. Jennings was an enslaved man who worked in the president's house as a footman and later as President Madison's personal valet. He was present for the whole terrifying event and played a direct, heroic role in saving the nation's treasures. Paul Jennings was only 15 years old when the British marched into Washington. As described earlier, he was one of the two men Dolly Madison tasked with saving the massive, iconic portrait of George Washington. Jennings was a witness not just to the panic and the flight of the government, but to the entire burning of the president's house. He would later write the first ever memoir of the White House by an eyewitness, a short but priceless document published in 1865. In his memoir, Jennings provides an incredible, on-the-ground view of the chaos. He recounts how he and a man named Barker had to use an axe to chop the heavy, gilt frame away from the wall to free the painting, which they then rolled up and spirited away. The painting was so important to the national spirit that saving it was, in a very real sense, saving a piece of America's historical soul from the flames. Jennings' account also offers a unique perspective on the Madison's flight. He describes how the president had to sleep in a small, damp cottage across the Potomac, hidden in the woods, with his clothes muddy and torn. The image of the father of the Constitution in such a state of undignified distress comes straight from the eyes of a young man who was serving him. After the British left, Jennings was there during the difficult early days of the return. He helped the Madisons set up their temporary homes, and he was part of the staff that worked tirelessly during the long, slow process of rebuilding the White House. For the next 2 decades, he continued to serve James Madison, eventually accompanying him back to his Virginia plantation, Montpelier, after Madison's presidency ended. Jennings' life story, however, highlights the deep irony at the heart of the American experiment. He was saving the symbols of liberty and democracy while simultaneously being the legal property of the very man whose freedom he was helping to preserve. His situation embodied the great moral contradiction of the early republic. The story doesn't end with the fire. Years later, Jennings finally secured his freedom. Even more remarkably, in 1848, he organized and helped purchase the freedom of his wife and children. And in an amazing twist of history, it was none other than the famous Senator Daniel Webster who provided Jennings with the money to purchase his own freedom from Madison's estate. The fact that a once enslaved man who saved one of the nation's great treasures went on to write the first memoir of the White House and secured his own family's freedom makes him one of the true, unsung heroes of this weird, fiery chapter in American history. His story reminds us that history is often made by the people we rarely hear about. The rebuilding of the White House was a long and arduous process, dragging on for years. Though the Madisons were able to move into the partially completed structure by 1817, at the start of President James Monroe's term, the house was far from finished. The east and west wings, which are now famous, would not be added for decades, and the internal decorations were basic compared to the grandeur they would eventually achieve. The main job of the new president, James Monroe, was to finish the house and fully furnish it. The government had lost virtually everything in the fire: furniture, silver, China, and art, and Monroe was tasked with starting from scratch. He used federal funds to buy new, often lavish, furnishings from France to restore a sense of dignity and international prestige to the presidential home. His goal was to show the world that the American government was back in business, more stable and refined than ever before. Even today, though the White House has undergone countless renovations and changes, some subtle scars from the 1814 fire remain. For the first few decades after the fire, the stone walls that survived the blaze were structurally unsound and had to be reinforced and repaired. During major renovations in the 20th century, especially under President Harry S. Truman, engineers discovered sections of original load-bearing stone that were severely weakened by the heat of the fire. Perhaps the most tangible and visible legacy of the fire is less about the structure and more about the psychology of the presidency and the city itself. The burning of Washington, D.C. created a massive public memory, a foundational moment of shared humiliation and subsequent resolve. For generations of Americans, the fire was a vivid reminder of the vulnerability of their young nation. It drove home the point that the country's freedom was not guaranteed and that even its capital could be laid low. This event quietly shaped the American government's long-term defense strategy, ensuring that the capital city was never again left so laughably vulnerable. It made the military establishment take the protection of the capital far more seriously. The fire also became a great unifier. Before 1814, the United States was a collection of deeply divided, quarreling states. The Federalist Party, which mostly lived in the North, was actually quite opposed to the war and to President Madison. In fact, some northern states had even held a convention to discuss secession from the Union during the war. But the sheer shock and outrage of a foreign enemy burning down the nation's capital created a national sense of shared danger and purpose. Seeing the symbols of their government in ruins was a powerful, emotional jolt that strengthened the feeling of being a single American people. The fire became a rallying cry, a shared wound that healed into a bond of national identity. In a strange, twisted way, the British had accomplished something the early American politicians could not. They had helped forge a more unified American identity. The rebuilding of the White House wasn't a meticulous, historically accurate restoration by modern standards. It was a rushed job under a huge political spotlight. President James Monroe and the architect, James Hoban, focused on getting the building functional and looking respectable again. As a result, some details were overlooked, and some materials were simply covered up instead of replaced. This leads to one of the most intriguing and persistent legends about the fire: the existence of a blackened, scorched stone wall hidden somewhere within the White House structure, a silent, secret testament to the 1814 blaze. The story goes that when the interior of the White House was being gutted and rebuilt, the builders were so focused on the exterior appearance and getting the structure stable that they left some of the interior load-bearing walls that were less visible but structurally sound. These walls were built of porous Aquia Creek sandstone and were severely scorched by the fire. Rather than fully replace them, they simply covered the char with layers of plaster and new construction. For decades, this was just a rumor, a piece of White House folklore. But in 1948, the White House was found to be in such a terrible state of disrepair that President Harry S. Truman ordered a complete, massive, and total renovation. The entire interior was dismantled, leaving only the outer walls standing. It was during this deep renovation that the legend was finally confirmed. Workers and engineers discovered that the inner sides of some of the surviving exterior walls, and even some of the interior foundation stones, were indeed deeply, permanently blackened by fire. The scorched stone was a visual confirmation of the destruction. It wasn't just a bit of soot. It was a heavy, smoky char that the lime-based whitewash and plaster had failed to fully penetrate or cover over the years. This original, blackened stone had been hidden from public view for over 130 years. This discovery gave the White House a tangible, physical link to its fiery past. The walls were photographed and documented, and the engineers knew they couldn't simply scrape the black off. The stone was too brittle and scarred. The decision was made to repair the damage and then once again cover the old, scarred stone with new interior walls and layers of plaster. So, somewhere deep within the walls of the modern White House, beneath the layers of paint, wallpaper, and drywall, those charred stones still stand. They are the true, silent witnesses to the War of 1812, a secret architectural memorial to the night the British came to Washington. It's a powerful thought. Every time a president walks those halls, they are separated by mere inches of drywall and stone from a deep, black stain, the physical evidence of a national disaster. The house itself carries the memory of its burning, an unseen scar that reminds everyone that even the strongest symbols can be brought down, but also that they can be rebuilt stronger than before. The house, in a way, is haunted by its own history. The story of the White House burning down is more than just a historical footnote about a failed defense. It's a powerful narrative about resilience and the birth of a true national identity. The fire marked the end of an era of American political innocence. Before 1814, the government often felt distant and secure. After the fire, everyone understood that the nation's core was fragile and had to be actively and fiercely defended. The event quickly faded from a source of shame into a source of pride. The narrative was reframed. The British could burn the buildings, but they couldn't burn the Constitution, and they certainly couldn't burn the American spirit. The massive, immediate, and determined effort to rebuild the Capitol and the President's house was the ultimate act of defiance. It was a tangible, colossal way of telling the world that America wasn't going anywhere. The legacy of the fire can be broken down into a few key points. The power of symbols. The fire proved just how important physical symbols of government are. The loss of the Capitol and the President's house was a stunning psychological blow because they represented the entire republic. The act of rebuilding those same structures, stone for stone, was an act of political reassertion. They didn't move the Capitol. They stood their ground and rebuilt exactly what the enemy had tried to destroy. The unifying force, as mentioned, the collective shock and outrage over the burning of Washington was a huge, involuntary step towards national unity. It helped break down the extreme partisanship of the time and created a sense of us against them that went beyond state lines. For the first time, Americans from Massachusetts to South Carolina felt a shared, personal stake in the federal government's existence and security. The White House name. The event is what cemented the name White House into the public consciousness. Whether the building was already informally called that or not, the visual image of a scorched, then freshly, brilliantly whitewashed building was a powerful one that resonated with the American people and became the official, enduring name. A lesson in defense. The embarrassing defeat at Bladensburg and the subsequent burning of the Capitol was a massive, humiliating lesson. It led to a fundamental overhaul of the nation's military readiness and defense strategy. No major world capital has ever been so easily seized and held by an enemy since, a testament to the lessons learned in 1814. The story of the White House fire is a dramatic, terrifying chapter that sits right at the beginning of the American narrative. It's a story of a young, arrogant country learning the hard way that freedom and sovereignty must be earned and re-earned every single day. The image of the president on the run, Dolly Madison saving Washington's portrait, and the eventual triumph of a nation rebuilding its symbolic heart against the odds is the true, enduring legacy of that weird, destructive night in August 1814. The rebuilding process was not a quick fix. It stretched well into the 1820s, requiring multiple administrations to complete. The sheer expense was enormous for the time, and it was a constant reminder of the war and the vulnerability of the government. By the time the White House and the Capitol were fully finished, they were actually grander and more resilient than the originals. The Capitol, in particular, was built with more fire-resistant materials and a stronger design, a direct response to the easy destruction of 1814. The fact that the United States chose to rebuild immediately and in the same location sent a powerful, enduring message to the world. It demonstrated that the young republic was not going to be intimidated or dislodged by a single military action, no matter how spectacular and destructive. The British had intended for the burning of Washington to break the American will, to force them to the negotiating table from a position of profound weakness, or even to cause the Union to splinter. In the short term, it worked. The negotiations in Ghent became more difficult, but in the long term, it had the opposite effect. The fire ended up serving as a crucible for American nationalism. It was a moment of profound testing in the national response. The determination to stay, rebuild, and carry on defined the character of the nation for the next century. It provided a shared narrative of a nation literally rising from the ashes, a powerful and lasting metaphor that Americans could rally around. The story of the burning is a reminder that history is often messy and unpredictable. Who would have guessed that a strong wind and a sudden hurricane, an act of God, would be the final factor that saved the remaining part of the capital from utter destruction and forced the British to leave? Who would have predicted that the man who saved the image of the first president was an enslaved teenager? The White House today, dazzling white and immensely powerful, stands not just as a monument to the people who designed it, but to the thousands of unnamed workers, the political leaders who refused to flee, and the spirit of a population that would not allow a single act of vengeance to define their future. Every stone, every column, every layer of white paint tells the story of that fiery night. It's a bizarre, almost mythological tale. A major world power marches into a young country's capital, eats the president's dinner, and burns the place to the ground. Then, a hurricane comes along and finishes the job for them, forcing them out. The country doesn't die. It just rebuilds, bigger and better, proving that the true seat of government is not in the stone buildings, but in the will of the people and the ideas they represent. The ultimate joke, perhaps, was on the British. They burned the White House, and in doing so, they helped create the strong, unified nation they had hoped to crush. The scars are hidden, but the lesson is clear. You can't burn an idea. And there it is, the terrifying, improbable, and utterly true story of how the very symbol of American democracy was once a smoking ruin. Can you imagine the chaos, the confusion, and the sheer terror of that night? The president on the run, the First Lady saving George Washington's portrait, and a massive storm rolling in to put out the British flames. It's a Hollywood movie waiting to happen. What part of this story shocked you the most? Was it the fact that the government almost moved out of Washington forever, or the fact that a hurricane played the role of the savior? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this bizarre piece of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more strange tales from the past, and ring the bell so you don't miss what we dig up next.